In 40 years of studying spiritual healing, I've discovered something that shook me to my core. There's one spiritual treatment that has never failed, not once, when properly understood and applied. Not for physical healing, not for emotional healing, not for life transformation. Today, you're going to learn exactly what it is. I'm Joseph Murphy, and I've dedicated my entire life to understanding the spiritual laws that govern healing and transformation. What I'm about to share with you isn't just another healing technique or spiritual practice to add to your collection. This is the fundamental principle that underlies every genuine healing that has ever occurred. You see, most people approach healing backwards. They focus on the condition they want to change, the problem they want to solve, the limitation they want to overcome. But focusing on what's wrong only strengthens what's wrong. The one truth that heals everything operates from the opposite direction. It focuses on what's eternally right, what's always perfect, what can never be damaged or destroyed. This isn't positive thinking or denial of problems. This is recognition of a spiritual reality that exists beyond all problems, beyond all conditions, beyond all limitations. When you learn to apply this one truth consistently, you discover that healing isn't something you have to struggle for or hope for. Healing is what naturally occurs when you stop interfering with it. Over the next 2.5 hours, I'm going to take you deep into this one truth that heals everything. We'll explore why most healing approaches only provide temporary relief, how to recognize the spiritual reality that's always perfect regardless of what appears to be wrong, and the exact steps to apply this truth to any situation in your life. You'll discover why trying to heal specific conditions often prevents healing from occurring, the spiritual principle that Jesus, Buddha, and all the great healers used to perform miracles, and how to practice what I call spiritual treatment that addresses the root cause of all suffering rather than just its symptoms. But I need to prepare you for something. What I'm going to share challenges everything our culture teaches about healing and problem solving. We've been trained to identify problems, analyze them, and then try to fix them. But this approach actually energizes problems and makes them more persistent. The one truth that heals everything reveals that there are no problems to fix, only spiritual realities to recognize. This isn't theory or philosophy. This is the most practical approach to healing that exists because it works with the fundamental nature of reality instead of against it. When you understand this one truth, you'll never again feel helpless in the face of any challenge, because you'll know that the power to heal everything is always present, always available, and always working through you. Here's something that might shock you to your very core. 99% of all healing approaches are actually preventing the very healing they're trying to create. They're not just ineffective, they're counterproductive. And if you've been struggling with any condition for months or years without experiencing complete healing, this is almost certainly what's happening to you. There are two types of people seeking healing right now. The first group focuses on the condition they want to change. They study their symptoms, research their diagnosis, fight their illness, and try to fix what's wrong. They approach healing like a war that must be won through effort, strategy, and determination. The second group has discovered something revolutionary. They've learned that the very act of focusing on a condition gives that condition power and permanence. The difference between these two groups? The second group understands that you cannot heal from the same level of consciousness that created the condition in the first place. They've learned that every condition, every limitation, every problem exists only because of a misidentification with something temporary instead of something eternal. Let me share something that completely transformed my understanding of why most healing approaches fail. Years ago, I was working with a man named Robert, who had been battling cancer for 3 years. He tried every conventional treatment, every alternative therapy, every healing method he could find. He'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, devoted countless hours to research, and approached his healing with military precision. But despite all his efforts, the cancer kept returning. Each time he thought he'd beaten it, it would reappear somewhere else in his body. Robert came to me exhausted, frustrated, and beginning to lose hope. "Joseph," he said, "I've tried everything. I've fought this disease with everything I have. Why isn't anything working?" That question revealed exactly what was happening. Robert had been fighting the cancer, but you cannot fight something without giving it reality and power. Every time he focused on the cancer, every time he researched new treatments, every time he monitored his symptoms, he was energetically feeding the very condition he was trying to eliminate. Robert wasn't healing, he was strengthening his identity as someone with cancer. He'd become so focused on the disease that the disease had become his primary sense of self. He woke up thinking about cancer, spent his days managing cancer, went to bed worrying about cancer. His entire consciousness was organized around the condition he was trying to heal. This is what I call the healing trap. The mistaken belief that you heal a condition by focusing on the condition. But focusing on any condition, even with the intention to heal it, energizes that condition and makes it more real in your experience. You cannot eliminate something by giving it your constant attention. Think about it this way. If you were trying to remove darkness from a room, would you fight the darkness? Would you analyze the darkness? Would you develop strategies to combat the darkness? Of course not. You'd simply turn on the light. Darkness isn't a thing to be fought, it's the absence of light. The moment light appears, darkness automatically disappears without any struggle or effort. Every condition you face is like darkness. It's not a thing in itself, but the absence of the recognition of your spiritual perfection. When you focus on the condition, you're trying to fight darkness with more darkness. But when you focus on your spiritual truth, you're turning on the light that automatically dissolves any appearance of limitation. But here's what's even more insidious about condition-focused healing. It creates what I call a healing addiction. The more you focus on healing a condition, the more invested you become in having a condition to heal. Your identity starts to revolve around being someone who's sick, someone who's struggling, someone who needs healing. I've worked with people who've been in therapy for decades, trying to heal childhood trauma. I've met individuals who've spent years attending healing workshops, always working on their issues. I've encountered folks who've made their entire spiritual journey about overcoming their limitations. And what I've discovered is that many of these people don't actually want to be healed. They want to be healing. There's a profound difference between wanting to be healed and wanting to be healing. When you want to be healed, you're seeking an end to the condition. But when you want to be healing, you're actually seeking to maintain the condition because it gives you an identity, a purpose, a sense of meaning. This isn't conscious, of course. Nobody deliberately chooses to remain sick or limited. But unconsciously, many people become attached to their problems because solving the problems would require them to find a new identity, a new purpose, a new way of understanding themselves. This is why so many healing journeys become endless searches rather than successful completions. People jump from one healing modality to another, always looking for the technique that will finally work, never realizing that the very act of searching is preventing them from finding what they're looking for. The spiritual law that governs this is simple but profound. Whatever you focus on expands in your experience. When you focus on illness, you expand illness. When you focus on lack, you expand lack. When you focus on problems, you expand problems. This isn't because the universe is punishing you. It's because consciousness is creative, and whatever you give your attention to, you're literally creating more of. Most people think they're focusing on healing, but they're actually focusing on the condition they want to heal. They think about their symptoms, research their diagnosis, monitor their progress, compare their situation to others with similar conditions. All of this attention is going to the condition, not to healing. Real healing requires a complete reversal of attention. Instead of focusing on what's wrong, you focus on what's eternally right. Instead of identifying with the condition, you identify with your spiritual perfection. Instead of trying to fix what's broken, you recognize what can never be broken. This doesn't mean you ignore practical steps or refuse medical treatment. It means you approach these things from a completely different consciousness. You don't use medical treatment to fix something that's wrong with you. You use it to support the perfect health that's already your spiritual reality. When Robert finally understood this principle, everything changed for him. Instead of fighting cancer, he began recognizing his perfect spiritual health. Instead of identifying as someone with cancer, he identified as the eternal, perfect spiritual being he truly was. Instead of trying to heal his body, he recognized that his real self, his spiritual self, had never been sick. This shift in focus, this change in identity, this recognition of spiritual truth created what his doctors called a spontaneous remission. But Robert and I knew it wasn't spontaneous at all. It was the natural result of withdrawing attention from the illusion of sickness and placing it on the truth of perfect health. This brings me to the second major mistake that keeps people trapped in endless healing cycles. Most people think healing is about changing their physical condition, but physical conditions are effects, not causes. Trying to heal a physical condition without addressing the consciousness that created it is like trying to change your reflection in a mirror by painting the mirror. If you want to change what appears in the mirror, you have to change what's standing in front of the mirror. If you want to change a physical condition, you have to change the consciousness that's projecting that condition. The body doesn't create consciousness. Consciousness creates the body. This is why medical treatments often provide temporary relief, but rarely create permanent healing. They're working with effects rather than causes. They might change the symptoms for a while, but unless the underlying consciousness changes, the condition will usually return in the same form or manifest as a different condition. I'm not saying that medical treatment is wrong or useless. I'm saying that when you combine medical treatment with spiritual treatment, when you address both the effect and the cause, you create the conditions for complete, permanent healing. But here's the challenge that most people face when they first encounter this understanding. They've been conditioned to believe that their problems are real, solid, permanent things that exist independently of their consciousness. They've been taught that conditions happen to them rather than being created by them. This victim consciousness is the foundation of all healing difficulties. When you see yourself as a victim of circumstances, you feel powerless to change those circumstances. When you see conditions as happening to you, you can only hope that something outside of you will save you. But when you understand that consciousness creates conditions, you realize that you have the power to create different conditions by changing your consciousness. When you recognize that you're not a victim of your body, but the creator of your experience, you step into the power that can heal anything. The one truth that heals everything is based on this fundamental understanding. You are not a physical being having spiritual experiences. You are a spiritual being having physical experiences. Your real identity is not your body, your personality, your history, or your conditions. Your real identity is the perfect, eternal, unlimited spiritual being that you've always been. Every condition you face is a case of mistaken identity. You've identified with something temporary and forgotten something eternal. You've focused on what appears to be limited and lost sight of what's actually unlimited. You've believed in what seems to be imperfect and forgotten what's absolutely perfect. The moment you remember your true identity, the moment you recognize your spiritual perfection, the moment you focus on what's eternally right instead of what appears to be temporarily wrong, that's the moment healing begins to occur, automatically, effortlessly, and permanently. But this isn't just about changing your thoughts or trying to think positively. This is about a fundamental shift in identity, a complete reversal of attention, a recognition of truth that transcends all appearances. What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about yourself, about healing, and about the nature of reality itself. But once you truly understand this one truth, once you recognize it not just intellectually, but with every fiber of your being, you'll never again feel powerless in the face of any condition or circumstance. Here's something that might seem impossible at first, but I want you to stay with me as I explain it. Right now, in this very moment, you are absolutely perfect. Not potentially perfect, not working toward perfection, not perfect except for your problems. You are completely, totally, absolutely perfect right now, exactly as you are. Now I know what you're thinking. Joseph, that can't be true. I have problems. I have limitations. I have conditions that need healing. How can you say, I'm perfect, when I'm clearly not? This reaction is natural, because we've been conditioned to identify perfection with physical circumstances rather than spiritual reality. There are two versions of you that exist simultaneously. There's the temporary you, the personality, the body, the collection of experiences and conditions that seem to define your current situation. And there's the eternal you, the spiritual being, the perfect creation of infinite intelligence, the unlimited consciousness that's having a temporary human experience. Most people identify with a temporary you and forget about the eternal you. They look at their body and see imperfection. They look at their circumstances and see limitation. They look at their challenges and see problems that need to be solved. But this identification with the temporary is what creates and perpetuates every condition they're trying to heal. The eternal you, your real spiritual identity, knows no limitation, no illness, no lack, no fear, no doubt. The eternal you is the perfect expression of infinite love, infinite wisdom, infinite power. The eternal you is whole, complete, and lacking nothing. The eternal you is what you truly are beneath all the temporary appearances. Let me share a story that illustrates this perfectly. Several years ago, I worked with a woman named Sarah, who had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. For 5 years, she had watched her physical abilities deteriorate. She was told by doctors that her condition was progressive and incurable, that she could expect continued decline in her mobility and cognitive function. When Sarah first came to see me, she was in a wheelchair, struggling with speech difficulties and deeply depressed about her prognosis. She had tried every medical treatment available, had explored numerous alternative therapies, and had spent thousands of dollars on supplements and special diets. Nothing had stopped the progression of her symptoms. "Joseph," she said during our first meeting, "I don't understand why this is happening to me. I've always tried to live a good life. I've helped others, I've been spiritual, I've prayed for healing, but I just keep getting worse. What am I doing wrong?" Sarah's question revealed her fundamental misunderstanding about healing. She was identifying completely with her temporary physical condition and had forgotten about her eternal spiritual reality. She saw herself as someone with multiple sclerosis rather than as a perfect spiritual being having a temporary experience of limitation. I asked Sarah a question that shocked her. "Who are you beyond your body?" She looked at me with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I am my body. This disease is destroying my body, which means it's destroying me." This is exactly the misidentification that prevents healing. Sarah had confused her temporary physical experience with her eternal spiritual identity. She thought that because her body appeared to be sick, she was sick. She believed that because her circumstances appeared to be limited, she was limited. But your body is not you, any more than your clothes are you. Your body is something you inhabit, something you express through, something you use to have experiences in the physical world, but it's not who you are. Who you are is the consciousness that animates the body, the spirit that thinks, the thoughts, the eternal being that has the experiences. I taught Sarah to recognize her true spiritual identity. Every morning and evening she would practice what I call identity recognition, consciously acknowledging who she really was beyond all temporary appearances. She would say, "I am a perfect, eternal, spiritual being. My true self knows no limitation, no illness, no decline. I am the magnificent creation of infinite intelligence, expressing perfect health and vitality." At first, this felt like lying to Sarah. How could she claim to be perfect when she was clearly imperfect? How could she declare perfect health when she obviously had a serious illness? But I explained to her that she wasn't lying. She was recognizing a deeper truth that existed beyond physical appearances. Think of it this way. If you're watching a movie and the character on the screen appears to be sick, does that mean the actor playing the character is actually sick? Of course not. The actor is completely healthy while playing the role of someone who's ill. The illness exists only in the character, not in the actor. You are the actor, and your physical experience is the character you're playing. The character might appear to have limitations, challenges, or health issues, but these don't affect the real you any more than a movie role affects the real actor. When you identify with the character instead of remembering that you're the actor, you start to believe that the character's problems are your problems. The spiritual truth is that you are not the character. You are the eternal, perfect, unlimited consciousness that's playing the character. When you remember this truth, when you identify with your spiritual reality instead of your temporary experience, the character naturally begins to reflect the perfection of the actor. As Sarah continued practicing identity recognition, something remarkable began to happen. Instead of focusing on her symptoms and decline, she focused on her spiritual perfection and wholeness. Instead of identifying as someone with multiple sclerosis, she identified as a perfect spiritual being having a temporary experience of limitation. This shift in identity, this recognition of her true spiritual nature, created what her neurologist called an unprecedented recovery. Within 6 months, Sarah was walking again. Within a year, her MRI scans showed no evidence of the multiple sclerosis lesions that had been present for years. Her doctors couldn't explain what had happened, but Sarah and I knew exactly what had occurred. Sarah hadn't healed multiple sclerosis. She had recognized that the perfect spiritual being she truly was had never had multiple sclerosis. The condition had existed only in her identification with the temporary character, not in her eternal spiritual identity. When she shifted her identification from the temporary to the eternal, the temporary naturally began to reflect the perfection of the eternal. This is the one truth that heals everything. You are not what appears to be limited, sick, or challenged. You are the perfect, eternal, unlimited spiritual being that infinite intelligence created you to be. Every condition you face is a case of mistaken identity, and every healing is a recognition of your true spiritual nature. But here's what's crucial to understand. This isn't just a nice philosophical idea or a positive affirmation to repeat. This is the fundamental reality of who you are. Your spiritual perfection isn't something you're working toward or hoping to achieve. It's something you already are and have always been. The reason most people don't experience this perfection is because they're looking for it in the wrong place. They're trying to find perfection in their physical conditions, their circumstances, their experiences. But perfection doesn't exist at the level of form, it exists at the level of consciousness. Your body might appear to be imperfect, but the consciousness that animates your body is perfect. Your circumstances might appear to be limited, but the spirit that creates your circumstances is unlimited. Your experiences might appear to be challenging, but the being that has the experiences is eternally at peace. When you shift your attention from the appearance to the reality, from the form to the consciousness, from the temporary to the eternal, you begin to experience the perfection that you've always been. This isn't about changing your physical condition. This is about recognizing the spiritual truth that transcends all physical conditions. Think about the sun for a moment. Sometimes the sun appears to be hidden behind clouds. From your perspective on Earth, it might seem like the sun has disappeared or become dimmed. But has the sun actually changed? Is the sun less bright because clouds are covering it? Of course not. The sun continues to shine with perfect brightness regardless of whether clouds are obscuring your view of it. Your spiritual perfection is like the sun. It's always shining with absolute brightness regardless of what temporary conditions might be obscuring your recognition of it. The clouds of illness, limitation, fear, or struggle don't affect your spiritual perfection any more than physical clouds affect the sun's brightness. Healing happens when you stop looking at the clouds and start recognizing the sun that's always been shining behind them. The clouds don't need to be fought or removed. They dissolve naturally when you focus on the light that's always present. This is why trying to heal specific conditions often prevents healing from occurring. When you focus on the condition, you're looking at the clouds and forgetting about the sun. When you focus on your spiritual perfection, you're recognizing the sun that makes the clouds irrelevant. But let me address something important. Some people worry that recognizing their spiritual perfection means they're supposed to deny their current experience or pretend their challenges don't exist. This isn't about denial. This is about perspective. You can acknowledge that your character appears to be experiencing challenges while simultaneously recognizing that you, the actor, are perfect and unlimited. You can deal practically with temporary conditions while maintaining awareness of eternal truth. You can take appropriate action in the physical world while keeping your identity anchored in spiritual reality. The key is not to get lost in the character's story. Don't make the character's problems your identity. Don't confuse the role you're playing with who you really are. Handle whatever needs to be handled, but do it from the recognition of your spiritual perfection rather than from identification with temporary limitation. Now that you understand your true spiritual identity, you need to know how recognizing this truth actually creates healing and transformation in your physical experience. Because without understanding the mechanics of how consciousness affects reality, you might dismiss this as wishful thinking rather than recognizing it as the most precise science that exists. Here's something that will fundamentally change how you think about the relationship between mind and matter, between consciousness and conditions, between who you are and what you experience. Every single thing in your physical reality, your body, your circumstances, your relationships, your challenges, is a direct reflection of your consciousness, your identity, your deepest beliefs about who you are. This isn't mystical speculation or religious doctrine. This is the emerging understanding of quantum physics, consciousness research, and what I call the science of spiritual treatment. When you truly grasp this principle, you realize that you're not a victim of physical conditions. You're the creator of physical conditions. Most people have this backwards. They think their consciousness is created by their brain, their identity is determined by their experiences, their beliefs are formed by their circumstances. But the opposite is true. Your consciousness creates your brain function, your identity determines your experiences, your beliefs form your circumstances. Think of consciousness as a projector and physical reality as a screen. Whatever film is running in the projector appears on the screen. If you don't like what's appearing on the screen, you don't try to change the screen, you change the film in the projector. Your consciousness is the projector, and your physical experience is what appears on the screen. When you identify with limitation, illness, or lack, you're running a film of limitation in your consciousness projector. This film creates corresponding images on the screen of your physical experience. No matter how hard you try to change what's appearing on the screen, it keeps reflecting whatever film is running in the projector. But when you shift your identification to your spiritual perfection, you change the film that's running in your consciousness projector. You start projecting wholeness instead of illness, abundance instead of lack, unlimited possibility instead of limitation. The screen of your physical experience automatically begins to reflect these new images. This is why spiritual treatment works when physical treatment fails. Physical treatment tries to change the images on the screen without changing the film in the projector. Spiritual treatment changes the film in the projector, which automatically changes what appears on the screen. Let me share a story that perfectly illustrates this principle. I once worked with a businessman named Michael who was facing what seemed like complete financial ruin. His company was bankrupt, he was personally liable for millions of dollars in debt, and he was on the verge of losing his home, his family, and everything he'd worked for over 20 years. Michael had tried every conventional approach to solving his financial crisis. He'd hired the best attorneys, negotiated with creditors, explored bankruptcy options, and even considered moving to another country to escape his debts. But every solution seemed to create new problems, and his situation continued to deteriorate. When Michael came to me, he was desperate and exhausted. "Joseph," he said, "I've done everything humanly possible to fix this situation. I've worked 18-hour days. I've sacrificed my health and my relationships. I've tried every strategy my advisors could think of. Nothing is working. I feel like I'm cursed." Michael's language revealed exactly what was happening in his consciousness projector. He identified as someone who was cursed, someone who was a victim of circumstances, someone who was fighting against overwhelming odds. This identity of struggle and limitation was the film running in his projector, and it was creating corresponding experiences of struggle and limitation on the screen of his life. I taught Michael about the science of spiritual treatment. I explained that his financial difficulties weren't happening to him, they were happening through him. His consciousness was creating his experiences, not the other way around. If he wanted to change his experiences, he had to change his consciousness. This was initially difficult for Michael to accept. Like most people, he'd been conditioned to believe that external circumstances create internal experiences, rather than understanding that internal consciousness creates external circumstances. He thought his stress was caused by his financial problems, when actually his financial problems were being perpetuated by his stress consciousness. I showed Michael how to practice identity shifting, consciously changing his identification from someone experiencing financial crisis to someone experiencing financial abundance. This wasn't about denying his current circumstances, or pretending his debts didn't exist. This was about recognizing that his true spiritual identity was that of an abundant being temporarily experiencing the appearance of lack. Every morning, Michael would spend 30 minutes recognizing his spiritual identity as an abundant, successful, prosperous being. He would acknowledge that his true self, his spiritual self, knew no lack, no limitation, no failure. He would identify with the perfect, unlimited consciousness that he really was, rather than with the temporary experience of financial difficulty. This practice felt artificial at first because Michael's external circumstances contradicted everything he was recognizing about himself. But I explained to him that he was changing the film in his consciousness projector, and it would take time for the new images to appear on the screen of his physical experience. As Michael continued this practice, something remarkable began to happen. He stopped feeling like a victim of his circumstances and started feeling like a creator of his circumstances. Instead of desperately trying to solve his problems from a consciousness of lack and fear, he began approaching his situation from a consciousness of abundance and confidence. This shift in consciousness, this change in the film running in his projector, created what appeared to be miraculous solutions. Business opportunities appeared that he'd never noticed before. People offered assistance that he'd never expected. Creative solutions emerged that he'd never considered. Within 6 months, Michael had not only resolved his financial crisis, but had created the most successful business venture of his career. His creditors were paid in full, his family relationships were restored, and he achieved a level of prosperity that exceeded anything he'd experienced before his crisis. But the most remarkable change wasn't in Michael's external circumstances, it was in his understanding of how reality actually works. He realized that his financial crisis hadn't been caused by external factors. It had been created by his own consciousness of limitation and struggle. When he changed his consciousness, his circumstances automatically changed to match. This is the fundamental principle of spiritual treatment. Consciousness is cause, and conditions are effect. When you change the cause, the effect automatically changes. When you shift your consciousness, your circumstances shift to correspond. When you recognize your spiritual truth, your physical experience begins to reflect that truth. But this isn't just about positive thinking or visualization. This is about a fundamental shift in identity that goes deeper than thoughts or mental techniques. When you truly recognize your spiritual perfection, when you genuinely identify with your unlimited nature, when you actually embody the consciousness of your eternal self, you create what quantum physicists call a field effect. Your consciousness generates what scientists are now calling a morphogenic field, an invisible organizing pattern that influences everything in your environment. When you operate from a consciousness of perfection, wholeness, and abundance, this field organizes experiences of perfection, wholeness, and abundance around you. Think of this field as an invisible magnet that attracts experiences matching your fundamental identity. When you identify with limitation, your field attracts limiting experiences. When you identify with perfection, your field attracts perfect experiences. This isn't a metaphor. This is how consciousness actually operates at the quantum level. What I'm about to reveal will transform your understanding of every spiritual teacher, every religious text, and every healing miracle you've ever heard about. Because when you understand the one truth that heals everything, you realize that every great spiritual master throughout history has been teaching and demonstrating this same principle, just using different words and symbols that fit their time and culture. The method I've been sharing with you isn't something I invented or discovered. It's the same method that Jesus used to heal the sick, that Buddha used to end suffering, that every genuine spiritual teacher has used to transform lives and circumstances. They all understood the one truth that most of their followers missed, that healing comes not from changing conditions, but from recognizing the spiritual perfection that transcends all conditions. Let me start with the most documented example in Western culture, the healing ministry of Jesus. When you study his methods with an understanding of spiritual treatment, you see that he never focused on the diseases or problems people brought to him. He never analyzed symptoms, never discussed treatment options, never commiserated with suffering. Instead, he immediately recognized the spiritual perfection of every person he encountered. Look at the story of the man born blind. When Jesus saw him, the disciples asked whose sin had caused the blindness, the man's or his parents'. But Jesus immediately rejected the premise that anyone had caused the condition. He said the blindness existed so that the works of God could be revealed through healing. What Jesus was really saying is that the appearance of blindness existed to provide an opportunity to demonstrate spiritual sight, to reveal the perfect vision that was the man's spiritual reality. Jesus didn't see a blind man who needed to be healed. He saw a perfect spiritual being whose true sight had been temporarily obscured by false identification. This is why Jesus could say with complete confidence, "Your faith has made you whole." He wasn't talking about faith as a religious belief or hope for future healing. He was talking about faith as the recognition of spiritual perfection that already existed. The people who were healed had faith in their true spiritual identity rather than in their temporary conditions. When Jesus said to the paralyzed man, "Take up your bed and walk," he wasn't commanding a physical impossibility. He was speaking to the perfect spiritual being who had never been paralyzed, calling forth the recognition of wholeness that had always been present. The man's body responded because his consciousness recognized the truth of what Jesus was declaring. This is the pattern in every healing Jesus performed. He never fought against disease or tried to fix what was wrong. He simply recognized and declared the spiritual perfection that was always present, and that recognition created the conditions for healing to manifest automatically. But here's what most people miss about Jesus' healing methods. He wasn't using any supernatural power that ordinary people don't have. He was using the one truth that's available to everyone, the recognition that spiritual perfection is the reality of every being, regardless of what temporary conditions might suggest. When Jesus said, "These things that I do, you shall do also, and greater things than these," he wasn't talking to special disciples or chosen individuals. He was talking to anyone who would understand and apply the same principle he was demonstrating, the recognition of spiritual truth beyond all appearances. The Buddha taught this same principle using different language. When he spoke about the end of suffering, he wasn't talking about eliminating difficult experiences from life. He was talking about recognizing that your true nature, what he called Buddha nature, is eternally peaceful and can never actually suffer. Buddha taught that suffering exists only when you identify with what he called the false self, the temporary personality, emotions, thoughts, and conditions that seem to define your experience. But when you recognize your Buddha nature, your perfect, eternal, unlimited spiritual identity, suffering naturally ends because you realize that who you really are was never actually suffering. This isn't about becoming enlightened in the future or achieving some special state of consciousness. This is about recognizing the enlightenment that you already are, the Buddha nature that's always been your true identity. When this recognition becomes stable and consistent, what appeared to be problems naturally dissolve because you're no longer identified with the level of consciousness where problems seem to exist. The ancient Hindu tradition preserved this wisdom in the teaching of Sat Chit Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss. This describes your true spiritual nature as pure being, pure consciousness, and pure bliss. According to this teaching, every form of suffering comes from forgetting this truth and identifying with temporary limitations instead. Indigenous traditions around the world have preserved similar understanding through various healing practices and ceremonies. Many Native American traditions teach that illness and suffering come from spiritual disconnection, forgetting your relationship with the Great Spirit, with Mother Earth, with the sacred nature of all existence. What all these traditions understand is that you don't heal by becoming something different from what you are. You heal by remembering what you've always been. You don't transform by adding new qualities to yourself. You transform by removing the false beliefs that have been hiding your true qualities. This is why I call this approach spiritual treatment rather than spiritual healing. Treatment suggests working with what's already present rather than trying to create something new. When you recognize your spiritual perfection, you're not creating perfection. You're treating yourself as the perfect being you've always been. Now comes the most crucial part of everything we've discussed. How to actually live from the recognition of your spiritual perfection when you're dealing with real challenges, practical responsibilities, and circumstances that seem to contradict everything I've been teaching you, because understanding the one truth intellectually is just the beginning. The transformation happens when this truth becomes your lived experience. Here's something that stops most people from successfully applying spiritual treatment. They try to use it like an occasional medicine rather than establishing it as their fundamental way of being. They remember to recognize their spiritual perfection when they're feeling inspired or when things are going well, but they forget it the moment they're faced with challenging circumstances. But spiritual treatment isn't something you do occasionally when you remember or when you feel like it. Spiritual treatment is something you become. It's a complete shift in how you identify yourself, how you interpret your experiences, and how you respond to everything that happens in your life. Let me show you how this works in practical, everyday situations. Let's say you wake up feeling sick. The ordinary response would be to identify with the sickness. I'm sick. I feel terrible. I hope this doesn't last long. But spiritual treatment approaches this completely differently. Instead of identifying with the temporary experience of feeling sick, you recognize your eternal spiritual identity as a perfect, healthy, vital being. You don't deny that the body appears to be experiencing symptoms, but you don't make those symptoms your identity. You handle whatever practical steps seem appropriate while maintaining awareness that your true self, your spiritual self, is always perfectly healthy. This might sound like denial or positive thinking, but it's actually the most practical approach possible. When you identify with sickness, you reinforce the pattern of sickness in your consciousness. When you identify with your spiritual perfection, you reinforce the pattern of health. Since consciousness creates conditions, identifying with health rather than sickness actually supports your body's natural healing processes. I remember working with a nurse named Linda who was constantly getting sick despite working in a hospital where she was exposed to germs daily. She tried every immune-boosting supplement, every protective measure, every health practice she could think of, but she still caught every bug that came through her ward. When I taught Linda about spiritual treatment, she initially resisted the approach. "Joseph," she said, "I work with sick people all day long. I see real suffering, real illness, real medical emergencies. How can I pretend that sickness isn't real when I'm surrounded by it constantly?"